In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Please be seated. There is a word that goes around in the news a lot. You may have heard of it. It's called convicted. Somebody's convicted of something. There was one where there was a pharmaceutical owner who was convicted of pushing opioids on people illegally. There was one of a cop who was convicted of shooting somebody who was unarmed. There was one of a black man who was released from prison after having been falsely convicted and serving 17 years in prison. That's just recently in the news. So whenever we hear that word convicted, usually we have sort of these negative connotations. It means somebody got in trouble. And sometimes it's unjust and they get punished for doing something they didn't do. Sometimes, most of the time, they get punished for doing something they did do wrong. And sometimes that punishment is imprisonment or a fine, or if you have the right connections, a slap on the wrist. But in general, being convicted, we consider to be a negative. And it's actually not much different when you think of being convicted in a different sense, which is to say, in the religious sense. You may have heard people say, I've been convicted, or I've been convicted by the Lord. We're Episcopalians, we don't say that. And when we hear that phrase, we think of evangelicals or fundamentalists, and we think, well, we're better than that. We wouldn't say something like that. However, that is a mistake. Because there is, in a sense, of being convicted by the Lord. And if we don't understand that, then we're missing something. Fortunately for us today, the Scriptures address this in a way that we can grasp and embrace, I think. We start off with the story of the Gospel, and I love this story because it's only in John, and it has these improbable things that just fit so wonderfully. You've got the disciples who are depressed and they're confused, and yes, there's been a sort of a vision of Jesus already. They've encountered him once, but they're still kind of confused. I mean, these are not, these are still young guys. And Peter, in this sort of moping around together, he just gets up and says, I'm going fishing. And the other's like, well, we'll go with you. By the way, that would never be me saying, I'll go with you, because no, I don't do the fishing thing. But Peter had grown up as a fisherman. And so he's going back to this thing that is familiar to him, comfortable to him. He knows how to do this because he grew up doing this as his father is a professional. He is a professional. He knows this. And so in a sense, he says, with all this confusion, let me go back to what I know. And they fish all night. Because in those days, typically, they would fish, using a net, and they would fish at night. And there's another part in here that may seem kind of odd that says they've stripped down to almost nothing, almost naked. That's how they would do it. So they're fishing all night, and they catch nothing. And then, in the morning, they're like, okay, we quit. We're giving up. And some guy out on the shore yells out to him, says, hey, did you catch anything? Like, no. And he says, well, throw the net over to the other side of the boat and you'll catch stuff. Now, these are professional fishermen. And some yokel on the beach is yelling, go throw the net on the other side of the boat. What do you think of that person out there? He's like, come on, we know what we're doing. But no, they don't. They throw it over to the other side of the boat, and what happens? They get a lot of fish all at once. Peter automatically knows what's going on. And in one of my favorite little lines, he gets dressed and then jumps in the water and swims to the shore. And of course, it sounds silly, but of course he was working naked and he didn't want to present himself naked to whom he knew was Jesus. So he gets dressed, jumps in the water, swims to the shore. The others are struggling to get on back to the beach. And Jesus has got a fire cooking for him, right? He says, let's have breakfast. Let's go get some of that fish. And he cooks them breakfast. I just love that image. All this is great. But what really hits, and where this word conviction comes in, is when Jesus looks at Peter and says, Peter, do you love me? And Peter's like, oh yeah, of course. And then a little later, Jesus says, Peter, do you love me? And now you can see Peter squirming a little bit. It's like, yes, I love you. And then a little later, for a third time, Jesus says, Peter, do you love me? And Peter knows where this is going. And he's hurt. He says, you know everything. You know I love you. And you can almost hear his little brain saying, why are you asking me this? But he knows why Jesus is asking him this. Because it was 3 times that Peter denied Jesus on the night before he was crucified. 3 times Jesus says, I don't know him. And Jesus, in this little encounter, is convicting Peter. He's saying, you were acting in fear, in self-preservation, and now I'm calling you out of that. I'm calling you away from that fear. I'm calling you to be my apostle. Peter gets this, and it's very painful for him. But then, Jesus doesn't just sit there. It doesn't just stop with, you abandoned me. Because for the 3rd time, he says, now, go feed my sheep. Being convicted in the God sense means to be called away from a negative path. Perhaps a fault, perhaps just a path that's leading you nowhere. To be called away from that, but also to a new path. You're not running away from something, you're running to something, and that something is Jesus. And if you want another example, an even more acute example, look at Paul in the Acts of the Apostles today. Here he is still a highly religious man, completely convinced in his life, in his mind, that these Christians, these followers of Jesus, are bad, and he is going to do everything he can to wipe them out. And so he has been really active in getting them imprisoned. And now he's got permission to go to Damascus and go after the followers of Jesus there. But in this famous scene, he's blinded by this light. He's thrown down to the ground, and this voice says, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? Now, put yourself in Paul's place for a moment there. You've just been blinded by this incredible light, and you hear this voice. What is going through your mind at this moment? It probably begins with, uh-oh. But it also begins with, God is talking. And if God is talking, I better listen. Something really big is happening. So he says, Lord, who are you? And Jesus says, I am Jesus who you've been persecuting. And again, we have this moment of conviction. He has had spelled out for him what he is doing wrong. He has had spelled out for him the path that he's on is leading him nowhere. It's leading him away from God. That's what conviction is, right? When you're convicted, you know you're going on the wrong path. But Jesus doesn't leave it there either, does he? He says, now get up, go to Damascus. Somebody named Ananias is going to come and he's going to give you your sight back and he's going to tell you what to do next. And he does. And after 3 days of prayer, Ananias comes to him and he heals him. And he says, Brother Saul, the Lord has sent me to you. Something's going to happen for you. You've got some big work to do. Again, Paul, originally Saul, is convicted of the wrong direction he's going, the direction away from God, but he's also then led to a new direction, which brings us to a new sense of the word conviction. Because when you act with conviction, when you do something with conviction, that means that you know that what you're doing is what has to be done. You know that you have been called to it. But here's something interesting about conviction. In each of these cases, with both Peter and Paul, they don't act on their own. They're convicted and they're called, but that call is tested. Here's Peter on the beach, not by himself. It's not just him and Jesus. He's got the other disciples around him. They hear this too. They know. They see Jesus. They know what call they've received. And they understand what's happening with Peter. When you've got Paul, now I imagine his companions with him on the road to Damascus, they don't know what's going on. They hear the voice, but they have no idea, and they aren't followers of Jesus. So who knows what's going on in their minds? But we know that Paul had Ananias come. And then Paul studied with Ananias, and Paul was baptized by the church, and he was sent by the church to go and preach. So conviction, when you act with conviction in the Christian sense, in the sense of the church, you act because God's called you to a new path, but you also act because that call has been tested by the people you're representing. Just to say, the church, the body of Christ. And you're supported by that same body. So that when you leave this building and you go out there and you tell people about Jesus, you know that you're not just acting on your own. You know that you've got all of us behind you. This whole church, all of us, are with you in that. That's what conviction means. You can act with boldness because you know that God has called you. You know that the people of God are with you. You can act with confidence because you know God has called you and the people of God are with you. What you can't do is just do whatever you like. That's not what conviction is. If you say, well, I know that God has called me to have that vacation in Aruba, I promise you that's probably not what God has called you to. That's not conviction, that's wanting a vacation in Aruba. One of the other things conviction isn't is an easy path. When you're convicted by God to go and do something, you can almost always guarantee it ain't going to be easy. Peter faced imprisonment, trial, torture, death. Paul faced imprisonment, beatings, more imprisonment, more beatings, more imprisonment, trial, and eventually death. It was not an easy path. To act with conviction means to act despite the difficulty, because God has called you away from a path that leads away from God and to a path that serves God. Because God has given you this body to support you in that mission. So let me ask a question. Have you been convicted? Have you heard God call you away from a path leading to nowhere? Have you heard God calling you to something new? If you have you tested it? Have you tested it with the people of God? Have you said, this is what I'm hearing, what do you think? And if you haven't done that, and if you haven't acted on it, then why not? It's a really good question to ask yourself. Have I been convicted? Have I acted? And if not, why not? Because I assure you, to be convicted by the Lord can only be good. Amen.